How's it going, guys? Joe here. Today we're going to be overviewing and concluding the hearing aid project that I've been doing. So let's just jump right in. So I did actually do some live streams over the past year or two on this project, but don't worry, I'm going to be overviewing all the context you need to know right here, as well as giving the final conclusion to the project. So without further ado, let's just jump right in. So what is this project? Well, the idea is I wanted to be able to connect my Mac to my hearing aids wirelessly, sort of like connecting Bluetooth to a pair of headphones wirelessly. So, I'm hard of hearing. Those of you who are wondering a little bit about that, I was born with a condition called Bohr syndrome. That's basically how I got my hearing loss, and as a result, I wear hearing aids. And now the hearing aids have gotten quite advanced compared to when I first got them. Now it actually supports wireless streaming. So back then you used to have this device that you'd wear which allows your hearing aids to stream using this third-party accessory. But now hearing aids allow you to stream directly to the hearing aids wirelessly, which is pretty awesome. So basically right now, I can stream my Android phone to my hearing aids wirelessly. So if I were to play YouTube or something on here, the audio automatically goes to my hearing aids, which is great. Same with phone calls, that's quite handy as well. And if I want to use it with a computer or something that's got a 3.5 millimeter jack, I have a third party accessory which looks like this, and it's got a 3.5 millimeter jack right here, and that allows me to connect it directly to the computer, and then I can just connect directly to this thing. It's kind of weird because this is also a microphone and I'm hearing myself through this because I'm currently tuned into it. But now I'm going to plug in the 3.5 millimeter jack. So now it's hooked up to my computer, so any sounds that go through my computer that I'm live streaming from, I'll start hearing that sound. So this is actually quite handy technology. Now when I got these hearing aids, they said that I would be able to connect to my hearing aids directly to the Mac. And unfortunately that doesn't really work. So if I try to connect to my hearing aids via Bluetooth, it just won't work. So on the live stream, I tried connecting my hearing aids. This is the past live stream. I tried connecting it to Bluetooth, but my hearing aids just don't show up even though I've done the correct pairing process. It works on the phone like you would imagine, but I did it on my phone. My hearing aids show right up, and that's actually quite straightforward. So unfortunately I can't connect directly to the Mac. So what I understand right now is if you want to connect it to the Mac, you have to actually connect it to an iPhone, which then goes to the Mac, which that makes absolutely no sense because first of all, that doesn't seem like Apple if you ask me. They try to make their products as seamless as possible, and that's what I would hope they do anyway. And to make it seamless, somehow connecting your laptop to your hearing aids requires your phone. Like you literally have to connect your phone to your hearing aids and then connect your laptop to your phone, which goes to your hearing aids. Apple just doesn't seem like they would do clunky stuff like that. Like, what kind of design requires a phone to connect to the hearing aids when the Mac could be perfectly capable of doing that all by itself? What kind of clunky design could you possibly have for that? I think at the moment you can probably blame just the different companies. So in my case, my hearing aids are Resound, whereas Apple is Apple. Though they're different companies, and I'm sure they don't particularly work together to make it as seamless as possible. I think Apple has their own Apple branded hearing aids, and you might be able to connect those directly to the Mac, but I can't do that with these. It's ridiculous that I need an iPhone to do that. If a Mac is so expensive, you would think that they would have the capability baked right in. I mean, iPhones are capable of Bluetooth, Macs are capable of Bluetooth, so why do you need an iPhone to connect the Mac to the hearing aid? That's ridiculous. A ridiculous design if you ask me. So what can I do about that? Well, I have that third-party accessory that I showed you earlier, which is what I currently do right now. But when I use my phone with it, so this is an Android, of course. I've always used Android. I'm sure I always will. But it comes with an app that allows you to do some configuration with it. So I can configure my hearing aids. Basically, hearing aids come with their own little programs on them, depending on what situation you're in. You can do all sorts of stuff, like a technology called telecoil, or just a normal mode, one that has speech enhancement that tries to mitigate background noise so you could hear people talking a lot clearer, which that's a pretty big deal for me because I get absolutely nothing without these things unless I'm in a really loud environment and everybody's naturally shouting and I take these things out, then I actually hear nothing but that person shouting, strangely enough. I'll talk more about that in an upcoming video. I'm going to probably make a video talking about my hearing loss journey in the future. I'll go over all those details, including telecoil stuff and being able to hear better without my hearing aids than with them. The one situation where that's true. Anyways, so what am I getting at? I kind of lost my train of thought. So I have an app on here that allows me to switch between different modes. That's what I was talking about. There's different modes. There's one designed to block wind noise if you don't have physical filters on the hearing aids. My prior hearing aids before these ones had a physical filter, so wind noise was almost never a problem. But now these ones don't have physical filters, so unfortunately that means we have to block the wind noise with software, which just isn't as good as physical blocking. I'm sure if you do any amount of sound engineering type stuff, you probably know this. It's best to get as many physical things as you can versus trying to artificially do stuff, which just doesn't work nearly as good. So there's a mode that helps filter out wind noise, but it makes it kind of hard to hear everything else. There's a normal mode. There's a mode designed for speech clarity, which is meant to work well in loud environments. There's also modes for any third-party accessories that you might have, like the one I showed, so I can hear sounds from my computer and whatnot. So I have a mode for that. I'm currently tuned into that right now. But if I click out of it, then I'll no longer hear what's going on through this. I actually have two of those devices. I have the other one connected to a different computer, so I just have to hold this button down to tune into that other one. And by the way, the app actually looks like this, so there's some footage of me demonstrating the app and switching between different modes. You can see that things switch on my screen when I actually press my hearing aids earlier. So I'm showing some of the settings on there that I showed throughout the live stream. So yeah, I could do all sorts of configuration with that, which is pretty cool. So it would be nice to be able to connect directly to my Mac without a third-party accessory, because it'd be nice to not have to carry that thing around like everywhere I go. Or if it's being used by somebody else and I want to be able to use my audio from my Mac, then being able to connect wirelessly would solve that whole problem. I could do it with my phone. I don't need any special accessories for that, but I do for the Mac. So yeah, you can natively connect iPhone and Android, but in order to connect a Mac on Mac OS, you need an iPhone somehow. You would think that with how Apple consolidates their products and makes everything as seamless as possible, you would think that they would allow a direct connection, because the more things that you have in your pathway, and what I mean by pathway is the Mac is an item in the pathway. We could call that a node, I guess. The phone is a node as well, and the hearing aids are also a node. So there's 3 nodes required just to connect my Mac wirelessly, and any one of those things could go wrong. I would prefer to have the least amount of nodes possible, because, well, things are less likely to go wrong just by the nature of having less, first of all. And second of all, there's going to be increased latency for every single node you're connecting. That doesn't make sense that you need a phone to connect the Mac, because all that's going to do is introduce more latency than there already is. When I use Bluetooth, there is a fair bit of latency. I want to say there's at least a half a second worth. And that's something you could learn to get used to over time. But yeah, if I'm watching a video, everything is a little bit out of sync. And I think that's how headphones work in general with Bluetooth. Bluetooth, I think, is to blame for that. Maybe newer Bluetooth technologies aren't quite as bad, but there is a fair amount of latency. But with that third-party accessory, there's almost none whatsoever. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's probably less than 25 milliseconds if I had to guess. So what am I getting at with the latency? Well, yeah, the more nodes that are in the pathway, I would think that would increase the latency for each and every one of them, which to me, that's a horrible design. If I was engineering a design like that, I would minimize how many nodes are involved. Otherwise, we're going to have major reliability issues. So, yeah, so anyway, we know that the only way to connect to my Mac right now is using that third-party accessory. Otherwise, I can connect my phone directly. Or I could get an iPhone to connect wirelessly to the Mac. But again, that's like having a third-party accessory as far as I'm concerned. Basically introducing the problem over and over again. So basically what this project actually entails, now I'm going to finally get to the point of the project, is there something I can do to basically work around all these limitations so I could connect to my Mac directly? Well, I happen to be into virtualization, where you could run virtual operating systems and stuff. And I got this idea that what if I were to virtualize Android and pass through all the necessary hardware to basically work around all this malarkey? Is there a way I could just virtualize Android, which, since you need iPhone or Android to do things directly, what if I could virtualize Android? Would I be able to connect my hearing aids directly to that virtualized environment and then have sounds go through there? Well, basically that's what this series was all about, trying to get that all figured out. So today I'm going to try to overview the conclusion and basically my final conclusion to this project. So since I don't have an iPhone, but I do have an Android, there's got to be some sort of clever workaround I can do to connect my Mac directly to the hearing aids without an iPhone and without that third-party accessory. So I want to be talking all about that today, basically. So there's a lot of different virtualization platforms you can get. The one that I decided to get was QEMU on Mac, primarily because of all the flexibility it offers. From what I've heard, it tends to have better performance than VirtualBox or anything like that. and the capability of passing through hardware is just a lot easier. And there's probably some caveats to that. Now that I think about it, I wouldn't be surprised if I would have been able to use Parallels, which is a virtualization platform designed for Mac that I think allows fairly easy pass-through. And I'll get into why I'm thinking about that later on. But for now, my goal is to try to see if I can accomplish this project using QEMU. So basically what I have to do at this point is install QEMU on the Mac, which here's some footage of me doing that. I just used the brew package manager and I followed some instructions for getting QEMU on the Mac. So this basically went on for quite a while, as you can imagine. And I finally got it installed as well as all the dependencies and stuff. And then next thing I need to do is get Android to run on QEMU. So once I got QEMU and all the dependencies, like libvirt and whatever else, the next step would be to get Android on there. So you can download a bunch of Android ISOs. There's Android x86 that you may have heard of. There's a whole bunch of different versions you can get online. And you could just download that and basically install it in QEMU. So I think this footage right here should show that I got it running. Yeah, so as you can see right there, that's the Android x86 installer on QEMU. So the next step would be to then install Android. So once I get it installed, then I obviously have to figure out how to get my hearing aids connected to that. So that's really where the challenges kicked in. Getting Android and getting QEMU really wasn't all that challenging. You just kind of figure out how to install it, which I went over in the live stream. And then once you get it installed, then typically on Android, when you pair your hearing aids, you want to actually use the Smart 3D app, which has a pairing mode and it has the right configuration and everything. So if you are going to pair Resound hearing aids, I would use the app, which will walk you through the whole pairing process. That not only pairs the device for streaming, but you can also like switch your programs and adjust the bass and treble and all these things if your audiologist allows you to do that. And yeah, quite a bit of control with the app. So coming from that mindset, you have to have Smart 3D installed if you want to pair the device. So once I got Android going, getting Smart 3D is the next thing. And that was my next step, because what if you can't even run it? Well, then this project is no longer feasible. So that was my next step. So I ended up installing Smart 3D, which you can get on the Android store. And to be clear, there's, depending on what Android x86 version you're using, it can actually be kind of difficult to run certain things, because first of all, you have to have compatibility with the app, and second of all, if you don't have that compatibility, then, well, what am I trying to get at? Well, depending on what version you're running, there may be some glitches. Like some of them don't properly connect to the network for whatever reason. Some versions just didn't, and some connected just fine. So I kind of did some trial and error between different Android versions to figure out what works with Wi-Fi and everything like that. So once I got that all figured out, then I installed the Smart 3D app. And unfortunately, when I run the Smart 3D app, it basically crashes. Every time I try to run Smart 3D, this is essentially what happens. It just crashes every time I try to run it. So that was a little bit discouraging. If I remember correctly, that's where I actually ended the live stream because I felt like I couldn't really do any more than that. So then what? Well, this actually happened quite a long time ago, so I'm trying to recall everything off the top of my head. I don't remember stuff very well. I don't even think I got it open in part 1, if I remember correctly. So I think this is probably where I start part 2 of the live stream. So now I'm coming with a fresher perspective of how to continue from here. And I decided, since it works with iPhone, doesn't Mac have iPhone simulation built into it? Well, as it turns out, you can simulate an iPhone on Xcode, which is a platform on Mac that you can use to develop apps for the iPhone. That comes with a simulator, as you can imagine. You'd want that in an app development environment. And I was thinking, if that can connect with Bluetooth just like an iPhone can, then perhaps that would give me the options I need. So I tried running an iPhone simulator, which, as you can imagine, that works just fine. As you can see, there's no Bluetooth options, but where I'm looking right there, that's actually the screen you would go to pair hearing aids. It's a little bit different than general Bluetooth. I don't know why they make it that way, but it's been that way for a really long time. I have an iPad that's like over 10 years old at this point, I believe. And on the iPad, I have been able to connect my hearing aids to that thing natively. If I go to the settings app and go to that accessibility hearing aids option, my iPad can connect to my hearing aid somehow, but not my modern Mac. What is going on here? Well, basically, long story short, I could not get it figured out. I tried pretty much everything I could think of, so the iPhone simulator is sadly out for this, which is kind of a bummer, because if you're trying to emulate iPhone, I would think you'd be able to do Bluetooth stuff like this. Wouldn't you need to be able to test that sort of thing in a development environment? I would think so. So that option is out as well. It's kind of hard to remember exactly what order I did everything in, but I think the most important part is that I cover everything. So I decided to come back to seeing if I could figure out how to get the Smart 3D app to run. So as you can see, it just crashes over and over again. I had a feeling that there was probably some way I could get it to run. My initial thought was to test different versions of Android and see if one of them works better than another. And I pretty much got the same behavior across every version. So that means I literally have like 8 different versions of Android x86 and also 64-bit versions. That didn't really make any difference either. However, I did look at the settings and I stumbled across a setting called Native Bridge, which just go to the settings and sorry, that was kind of fast, but if you go to settings and right there, there's a Native Bridge option. It's the very first thing listed on there. So I went to the Native Bridge and decided to enable that setting right there. And as I enabled it, then all of a sudden it started downloading something, which I thought that was curious, but it also gave me reassurance. So I let that run, and then I decided to run Smart 3D again, and guess what? Unlike before, yeah, that's right, it succeeded. So now I have the Smart 3D app running. As you can see, I'm genuinely shocked right there. I mean, I was discouraged for the longest time, so that was a very exciting moment right there. So by enabling the native bridge, I got the Smart 3D app working, and it works on pretty much any version, which is awesome. So from a feasibility perspective, so far it's looking like things are still possible, but it's hard to say for sure. So I got Smart 3D working, so there is a chance. So what do I have to do left in order to make a successful experience with this? Well, I need a way to be able to connect that version of Android directly to my hearing aids via Bluetooth. I need a way to be able to connect to Bluetooth somehow. Who knows how? So that's basically one of the next steps. And then another step would be to figure out how I'm going to get sound from the host system to that virtual machine, which then ultimately goes to my hearing aids. So at this point, I have to get Bluetooth working for the connection, and then sound working so that sound can actually go through from Mac OS rather than Android. How am I going to get that working? Well, kind of a tricky one, but if I can get past those steps, then this project will be successful. So in order to get Bluetooth working, it's not going to work right out of the box. You have to pass through a device. So obviously this isn't a virtual machine. It's kind of like a real machine to some extent, but it doesn't have direct access to all of your hardware. Some of the hardware is actually being emulated. Like basically you're taking RAM from your physical system as well as processing power and storage space, everything like that, and effectively allocating those resources to a virtual machine, which is like a machine within your existing machine. That's how I'm able to run Android on Mac while Mac continues to run at the same time. Virtualization is pretty cool in that sense, but it can overcomplicate a lot of stuff too, because it doesn't just directly have access to your hardware, especially with a Type 2 hypervisor, which basically means that it runs on top of an existing operating system. So you still have the overhead that your main operating system has, and then the virtualization creates additional overhead on top of that. But basically what you can get from that is you have to share resources. Both the host operating system and the guest operating system, it's called, are competing for resources. So in this case, I need access to Bluetooth. So if Mac has access to Bluetooth, how's the virtual machine going to get access? They're basically both competing for the same thing. It's a tricky one. That's not a very simple question to answer. So the easiest solution would technically be to get a Bluetooth dongle and then use USB redirection or USB pass-through to basically give the virtual machine that USB dongle. But I don't want to do that because a USB dongle kind of defeats the whole purpose. If I need a dongle, I may as well use that third-party accessory that I showed you before. It has the same inconvenience and the same original problem that I'm trying to solve, not create. So I'm not going to do anything with USB dongles at all. So that means the only Bluetooth I have is the host Bluetooth, which I'm not exactly sure what interface on the Mac that uses. It probably uses PCIe or some form of PCI. I would imagine that the Bluetooth card uses PCI of some sort. So that's kind of my next step, figuring out how to pass through Bluetooth. So I'm pretty sure that it's technically possible to pass through host Bluetooth. If you were to do something like that, you'd likely lose it on the host operating system, but I don't care since I'm only going to be using it on Android, and I'm not using like a magic mouse or anything like that. That's not a magic mouse. I'm using a whole different keyboard and mouse, so I don't need Bluetooth. So I think it should be perfectly fine to pass through host Bluetooth. But that proved to be a very big challenge, because not just losing the resources for the host operating system, which I'm fine with, but also what am I passing through? What is the actual device? In order to pass through a device, you have to be able to tell QEMU what device you're passing through. And another challenge that can often arise is you have to actually blacklist a device on the host operating system so that you can just pass it through directly to a virtual machine. Let's say you had a graphics card that you want to give this graphics card access to your virtual machine. How do you go about doing that? Well, you don't want the operating system to see it, because if it does, it's just going to steal control, then it's not available for a full true pass-through to the virtual machine. So one of the workarounds is to blacklist the GPU at the host operating system level. And that can require a lot of technical tinkering around if you want to do that, especially if you're doing that on Linux or some hypervisor, like a type 1 hypervisor. I don't know if there's really such thing as a type 1 hypervisor these days, but basically an operating system that's dedicated for virtualization, such as Zen Server or ESXi or something like that. Those are, I don't know if they're really type 1 hypervisors. You do need an operating system to run virtual machines, but the operating system is dedicated for those virtual machines. So you think it would help make things easy for passing through devices. But even with a hypervisor like that, you might still have to blacklist your device so that the hypervisor doesn't steal control. And yeah, a type 1 hypervisor should not steal control from physical devices like that. The fact that you have to blacklist devices, as far as I'm concerned, that's not a type 1 hypervisor if you really get into it. At least that's my opinion on it. Let me know if you disagree with me, but if it really was a type 1 hypervisor, you shouldn't have to blacklist anything at all. Everything should be readily available for the virtual machine. I'm rambling, but the original point is I'm basically trying to pass through Bluetooth, right? Well, blacklisting is something that I don't know if you can even do that on the Mac. I did do some research, but I don't think there's even a way to blacklist Bluetooth on the Mac. So at this point, I'm hoping that if I were to try passing it through, the virtual machine would just steal control, and then the host would no longer have access to it. That would be very simple and ideal. If it was able to just steal control, then done. But it's not quite that simple. So at this point, I'm basically trying to figure out what is the host Bluetooth that I'm actually passing through, and then how would I even go about passing that through. Well, I tried to look online and there's absolutely nothing straightforward whatsoever. I've even contacted some forums regarding this and nobody's gotten back to me, even on multiple forums that should in theory be able to help with that type of thing. And now we have chatbots like ChatGPT or Bing AI. And none of those have suggestions on how to do that either. So obviously at the time, I did not contact the forum yet during the live stream. But I did get this idea of, so basically QEMU, to be clear, that typically uses a command line. You're not getting a graphical interface. That does not mean you're doing anything wrong. It is a command line program. But there are front ends you can get for that. Most commonly, you're probably going to use Virtual Machine Manager. You'll probably also notice that a lot of so-called bare metal hypervisors actually probably utilize QEMU behind the scenes. So just to give you an idea on how prevalent QEMU actually is, if you use XCP-G, I think that uses QEMU behind the scenes. I also think Proxmox does. And also I do want to remind you, Proxmox is running on top of Debian. So as far as I'm concerned, it's just Debian with a bunch of stuff thrown on top of it. So, I mean, now you see what I mean? Like, would you really consider that a true bare metal hypervisor if it runs on top of Debian, which you can run standalone? And then like XenServer, that runs on top of BSD, I believe. Or else you can, I think there's a different version that can run on Debian for compatibility purposes. I can't remember. I might be thinking of something else like pfSense or else TrueNAS. Those are other things you can run in a virtualized environment, but that's not really relevant to this. The point of this live stream is not to talk about type 1 hypervisors and bash on them. That's not the point of this live stream, so I digress. Anyway, so one idea that I got for figuring out what Bluetooth device to pass through is to use a front end for it, like Virtual Machine Manager or Virt Manager, you might know it as. And why that might be special is I can add devices to pass through and it actually gives me a visual list of everything. When I try to figure this stuff out on the command line, I don't have a list and I just have to kind of guess what I'm actually doing. So yeah, if you look at this right here, I'm trying to get a virtual machine to run, but as you can see, I'm tweaking the command a fair bit. And yeah, so I might have to do a fair bit of tweaking to get certain things working. Otherwise, it's just not going to work, right? Well, Virt Manager basically gives me a front end, and with the command line, I don't really have a list I can reference. I'm sure there are commands to list certain things, but not in a very straightforward way, especially for what I'm trying to do. So if I can get Virt Manager working, then I should be able to easily list all the possible devices I can pass through, and hopefully I'll stumble across the host Bluetooth device. So before I did any of this, I believe I tried using command line utilities like lspci, or what else did I use? I used some similar commands to that. I don't think it was lshw. Those are command line utilities that can list certain devices that you have, and I might want to list the one I need for Bluetooth. So I did try that, but no luck. I think I might have tried booting into like a Linux Mint environment just to see if I could get that to list the Bluetooth device. And I mean Linux Mint on this Mac. You have to disable secure boot to be able to run that, but I got Linux Mint running and I don't think it really gave me much useful information. So anyway, I'm rambling. I'm just trying to explain how do I figure out what device I'm passing through. just kind of explaining some of the techniques. And I figure if anything will list what I need, it would be Virt Manager, because that populates all the possible devices at any given time. So I decided to try installing Virtual Machine Manager on the Mac. And it's kind of a convoluted process for several different reasons. First of all, with the Python configuration I had on the Mac, I had like multiple versions installed at once, and I think there were conflicts between all the different versions. So like I had 3.9, 3.10, 3.11, 3.7, 2.7. I think they all were causing conflicts with each other, because when you access the package manager and stuff, it usually references a very specific version. And not only that, but whatever you're trying to use to install some software, like the dependencies for Virt Manager, that hard code's a very specific number, which may end up being incompatible with the version of Python that I have installed. So a lot of the live stream was actually fumbling around trying to get the right version of Python installed. Long story short, I could not get that, at least using Brew. So I tried all sorts of stuff. There was a guide that shows how to install it using Brew, but what do you call those repository hosts? So typically when you install packages from a package manager, that comes from a certain repository, which is typically hosted by some sort of author. I know on Ubuntu you might use a PPA or something like that. Like basically a repository host. That's what I'll use as a term for this. So there's actually multiple repository hosts if you wanted to install Virtual Machine Manager using Brew, which is the default package manager for Mac. And none of them provided what I needed. And also the fact that I'm kind of using an unofficial package manager, I consider that sketchy in nature. So, but regardless, I could not get any of them to work. And there's another package manager, I think called Port or something like that. I forget what it's called, but Mac can use other package managers as well. And using those other package managers, I was able to actually get Virtual Machine Manager installed. So I just kind of copied all the dependencies I needed and figured out how to install through this other package manager, and it worked. So yeah, I think right here, oh, that's me trying to get it working with Brew, which just wasn't working at all. But when I use Port later on, which I don't think I have footage readily available for, that worked pretty flawlessly actually. So at that point I now have Virtual Machine Manager, and there it is. So as you can see, I can't actually run it with the typical terminal. I had to download a special terminal, because I think it uses like Xcorch or something like that. I needed that to be able to run it, but I decided to try it anyway, because what do I have to lose at this point? I can't figure out what the host Bluetooth device actually is. So I'm kind of stuck there. But either way, once I got that working, then I started looking through all sorts of devices I can add. As you can see, there's a bunch of different devices that can be added, and it gives a whole bunch of different options. So there ought to be something that works with Bluetooth, right? Well, I exhausted pretty much all the options here, and there was nothing useful for me, unfortunately. I wasn't sure if it was like a PCI device or some similar interface that I would just figure out what the identifier is so I can pass it through in QEMU. And then there's also the challenge that even if I figure out what the device is, what's the syntax that I use on QEMU for passing through that device? I imagine I could probably figure that out based on the device type. But I was also concerned that even if I found the device, would I have enough information to know what that is? Well, I did a bunch of fumbling around, and long story short, no luck figuring this out. So, for now, Bluetooth is out. Now let's talk about how the sound would actually work, because even if we get Bluetooth working, how do I get the sound from the Mac directly to my hearing aids? And I know I talked about the whole, I try to minimize as many layers as I can. You need like a Mac, an iPhone, and the hearing aids. That's like 3 nodes right there, and I try to minimize that to minimize errors. Technically that Android x86 counts as another layer, so I am a little bit of a hypocrite right there. But at this point, it really is one of my only other options. It's either using that third-party accessory or the hearing aid directly. There are technically other options where you can do audio streaming to Android using an app like SoundWire, and then you can technically stream the audio that way, but there's a lot of latency with that, so I pretty much automatically rule that out. So for now, we're just going to move on with the Bluetooth stuff and see if we can figure out how sound would work. How would I get sound to work? Well, I mean, first of all, we have to figure out how are we going to get the system's sound connected to QEMU. That's not going to be a typical pass-through like you might know it. But what if I can basically connect some audio device, but then also have system output to that same device? Sounds really complicated, but I'll just kind of skip ahead a little bit. So I use a utility called Black Hole, which is just basically a virtual audio device that has various channels, and you can pass things in and out of it. If you've used like VB audio cable on Windows, Black Hole is more or less the same thing, or at least allows you to accomplish similar goals. So at this point, I'm thinking I can technically output the system's sound to pretty much any device, including Black Hole. Would that provide an interface to QEMU? Because really, in order for me to pass through sound to QEMU, I need some sort of common interface. Common virtual interface, to be more specific. So would Black Hole provide the options I need? So the next step I decided to do is to figure out how to pass through Black Hole, because I can output audio to that device, but if I can't pass that through, then there's no point in doing that. So I select Black Hole, and I try to figure out, I can list all my audio devices to figure out what to pass through, but it doesn't automatically list virtual audio devices. It only lists the real ones, like my USB audio adapter or something along those lines. So what do I do if I'm stuck with that? Well, I did a bunch of research to try to figure out what sound devices can I pass through. And sadly, I could not find anything for Black Hole. But I think there were some options for Pulse Audio, which is something that you might be familiar with if you use Linux. Some Linux systems may use Pulse Audio. So I'm thinking if there's an easy way to pass-through pulse audio on the Mac, then I ought to figure out how to output audio to pulse audio. So if I can get pulse audio working, then I should be able to do that. But then, did you really think about how this is set up? Do I want to pass through an input or an output? Well, if you really break it down, the system's output on Mac is an output. But if we were to interface that with QEMU, to QEMU, that is an input. So technically, we have an output from Mac, and QEMU reads that as an input. That's how we want to be reading this. So then I'm wondering, is it possible for me to convert an input to an output for my hearing aids? How exactly would that work? Well, I found an app that can basically, well, if you look at Android and the nature of it in general, what constitutes as an input by default? A microphone. Like if you're calling someone on the phone, your voice is going through an input to that receiver or recipient. So I think that is the correct way to architect this. How do I convert Mac's audio output to a sound input for QEMU? And then I discovered there is an app that could convert microphone input to a Bluetooth speaker. So let's say you wanted your voice to go through a Bluetooth speaker, like if you need to announce something at the DJ or something. Well, there is an app that allows you to convert an input to an output and actually have it go through speaker. I think it gives you a fair bit of flexibility on what input and output you can actually select. So assuming I can get audio to go through, then I can treat that as an input on Android x86 and then use that app to convert it into Bluetooth output. And then that's where the Mac sound will actually go through. So that would allow me to do what I want right there. So how do I accomplish that exactly? Well, I looked into this, but basically we have a potential solution for audio. So now at this point, it's time to come back to the Bluetooth situation. I mean, it's kind of funny because what I'm effectively trying to figure out is the Bluetooth connection and then the sound output connection too, right? So I need to get the Mac sound output to go through Bluetooth to the hearing aids. Well, it's kind of funny because the root word of each thing involved is Bluetooth. Blue is a color in Bluetooth, and then black hole. Black is a color in black hole. So I thought that was a little bit ironic, just how that works overall. Everything I need has a color prefix just by coincidence. Anyway, that's not even the point I'm trying to make here. So yeah, what about Bluetooth? Well, now I'm at a point where I'm pretty much stuck. I'm getting nothing back from a forum, and I now have access to chatbots like ChatGPT or else Bing Chat. So what are my options at this point? Well, Bing Chat or ChatGPT was basically offering a suggestion to use a utility called Soundflower. But when I look deeper into that, Soundflower is technically, I mean, it makes me wonder, does that actually give me a Bluetooth connection when I can't already do that natively? No. Long story short, no. I could ramble about that for a while, but there's no point. Basically, long story short, Soundflower is really just an audio routing utility. And if I don't have paths to work with, it's not going to introduce any like a Bluetooth one. If it could introduce a Bluetooth path from my hearing aid into Soundflower, that'd be brilliant. But sadly, that doesn't work, so it's not going to give me any more Bluetooth than I already have. So my options are technically out. So basically the moral of the story is I have no way to do Bluetooth. And because of that, I didn't bother trying to get any further with the sound. So what is the conclusion at this point? I'm sure I probably skipped over a few nuances from there. Let me go through my footage to make sure I haven't really missed anything. So I already showed you Bluetooth. I showed you Virtual Machine Manager working. Yeah, I think I pretty much showed everything. This is what I haven't showed yet. This is basically me using that Smart 3D app further in QEMU. So as you can see, that technically works, but I have no way to like interface that with Bluetooth or anything. Also, before I gave up on this, I did try to see if I could get this working on host hardware. Because if I could get it working on a host operating system, that's another example of a feasibility analysis. Part 3 was about that, I believe. And it was a disaster. It's about as long as this live stream right now. Maybe even longer. But I got pretty much nothing accomplished. All I was trying to do was to see if I could get Bluetooth and the microphone input stuff working on raw hardware, not even virtualized, because that simplifies everything. I don't have to worry about pass-through of any kind. If I could get that to work, then I would assume I could extrapolate that into a virtualized environment on Mac. But I couldn't even get that to work, so total nonsense in that live stream. Nothing useful was accomplished. I have a video on my main channel called something about this. Everything went wrong in this live stream. This is actually the live stream that I'm referring to. If you watch that compilation, you may notice certain elements in there that kind of sound familiar with what I'm talking about right now. That's because it does have to do with this. It is on this project. I'm now doing the next live stream after that one. So this is a live stream after the disastrous one. So yeah, basically the final conclusion is, even after messing around with the chatbot, trying to get it working on physical hardware, the final conclusion is I basically can't do this anywhere. So now I'm going to give you the final conclusion. I think you probably already know what it is based on what I've shared so far. The final conclusion is, I mean, maybe if I got into it more, I probably could do it. But it's not practical for me right now, especially after all this other messing around that I've done. I mean, part 2 was literally a 5-hour live stream, like 4:59 something. And part 1 was like 3 hours. So lots of time went into this. Lots of time went into this outside of those live streams. And yeah. So basically there's no luck with Bluetooth. The sound probably would work, but because of Bluetooth not working, not going to mess with the sound either. So basically my conclusion is I'm going to keep doing what I've always been doing. I'm either going to use audio directly on the phone when I'm using the phone, or I'm going to use that third-party accessory like I always have been. One of the other reasons I wanted to do that virtualized Android is so I had another device that I could use to control my hearing aids because I can run the app on it. But that's not an option. So yeah, basically the solution for me is to just do what I've always been doing as it is. There's no point in trying to make it any more complicated than it already is. It just doesn't make any sense. So yeah, that's the conclusion. Just don't even do it. Sometimes the answer to a question is don't do that. Especially if it's an XY problem. And that's the idea that you have a problem that you're trying to solve, and then as you attempt to solve that problem, you come up with a solution, Y. But for whatever reason, that solution is not working, so now you're treating a solution like a problem on its own. So, I mean, you're basically trying to solve a solution instead of a problem. You should only ever solve problems rather than solutions. So, yeah, I mean, you can get really hung up trying to solve the solution, when in reality, when you look at the big picture, you should be solving the original problem at hand, X. So basically, yeah, you have the original problem, X, a solution, Y. Don't solve Y, solve X. And how does that apply to this? Well, I suppose, I'm trying to think of whether this counts as an XY problem. I guess it probably does. Considering I have a nice solution already, I just need to be more grateful about the solution I already have rather than trying to do something like this. I guess it is an XY problem, just given the fact that I already have the solution to work with. And yeah, I'm sure I could do this via a Bluetooth dongle, by the way, but again, that defeats the whole purpose. I have that third-party accessory. As far as I'm concerned, that's a Bluetooth dongle. I was hoping to temporarily get rid of it. Maybe not altogether, but enough that I can use it sometimes. And even if I did get the wireless working, there's probably going to be a lot of latency. Even if I did get it working, Pulse Audio could introduce some latency. The connection to the VM, and from the VM to here, that could introduce some latency. Whereas with the third-party accessory, that's very direct. So yeah, I think I pretty much covered everything we need. So I guess it is an XY problem because I was trying to solve Y by trying to get this pass-through stuff figured out when X, this is X, this is Y. I'm trying to solve Y when X is what I've always been doing that works perfectly fine. Sometimes it can be fun to try to figure out solutions like this, especially innovative ones like this. But when you get to a certain level where it just seems to be going downhill, I think it's important to recognize that early on and just move on when you look at the grand scheme of things. It's kind of a balance between a learning experience and saving time. It's always balance with these things, isn't it? Well, the only thing that would really make me move on, or at least try to carry on with this, is if there was a practical reason to do so. Like, maybe I'll learn about this or that. I mean, who would have known that you could use Pulse Audio to solve this problem, for example? Then I can learn that just how host Bluetooth works. I can learn all these different things in this process, right? So you kind of have to balance, do you want to do the learning experience or do you want to save time? Or do you want to do like a nice hybrid of the both, where you do some of the learning experience but also some saving time? So yeah, when you work on projects like this, you do have to keep that in mind. Look at the grand scheme of things and don't get too buried into what you're doing. Look at things from a broader picture. I don't know if you saw my video on my main channel where I do a Zoom call with myself, but if there's any takeaways from that video where I call myself on Zoom, it's to look at things from a bigger picture and don't get too caught up in things. That's the moral of the story. I mean, that does teach a lesson. It's not just entertainment, but it really does teach a lesson. Even though I was basically calling myself, the reason why I was so productive is, I mean, what's different with my other self compared to my main self? The perspective is really the only difference in that case. And just by trying to look at the big picture, you can accomplish a similar perspective to that. And now we have AI stuff, so you can even bounce ideas from an AI perspective. So I think it's important to recognize and get lucid about when we're failing to look at the bigger picture and try to catch that as early as possible. For this, I think I should have caught it a little bit sooner. That's why I do a lot of feasibility analyses with these types of things too, so that I could kind of stay in the bigger picture mode before I get too caught up in things. So yeah, I guess the takeaway from this is also don't get too caught up in things. Look at things from a big picture and the grand scheme of things. Like, what benefit is this really going to bring? Especially after all the stuff we went through. I mean, for the most part, it would be convenient if I could get this to work. But also, I could learn quite a lot just trying to do something like this. And I have learned quite a lot from this. I tried to share as much of it as I could here. But also, I'm now at a point where that learning isn't really going to go much beyond what it already is. Especially given how practical it now is. And the practicality can change over time depending on how things are going too. So I think it's very important to constantly assess this. And when I say constantly, I mean like not fully constantly. I mean if you're hyper assessing it, that's a little bit excessive, but to very regularly assess, like, am I still doing what's most practical? Try to engage logic when it comes to those types of things. And if it's losing practicality, try to recognize that, put an end to it. The purpose of this live stream is to have a proper conclusion for this project and kind of do a retrospective analysis. Even if you haven't seen any of the other parts, hopefully this should be enough to get you up to speed on the almost 8 hours worth of live stream plus hours off camera too that I went through. So hopefully you learned something useful from this, whether it's the project itself or the idea of not getting too caught up in things and looking at the grand scheme of things. Because remember, that can change over time. Even if you do it initially, that can change over time. So you need to keep on it. Keep looking at the grand scheme of things and constantly make adjustments and be opportunistic and everything like that. So, ramble over. I think that will be it for now. So, yeah. I might make the other videos available. If I don't, then this should actually be enough to be up to speed on everything. Otherwise, I think that pretty much is the conclusion. So if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to let me know. I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, yeah, I think that's it. So thanks for watching and have a good one. Peace.